research or senior research scientist at the Australian Nuclear Science and Technology Organisation, based in Sydney. She's part of a team that looks at sort of cave formation and how that can be used to explain sort of environmental and climate factors. So rainfall, discharge, and even things like historical fire events. So we're actually quite lucky over here in WA. We've got quite a few caves in the southwest, which is Pauline's actually going to be over here next week for a bit of research. So it's quite interesting to, you know, be in her back door. I think, if I'm actually not incorrect, I think the biggest cave in WA is the Jewel Cave in Augusta. I think it's actually open to, or people can actually view it. So that's cool if anyone's ever down that way. So Pauline's actually also a lecturer at the UNSW in Sydney, where she also has a few PhD students and honours students, which supervises as part of a few of the projects that she's on. So yeah, we're lucky to have her online today to have a bit of a chat with us. And yeah, if you have any questions, you can put them in the chat and we'll address them at the end, or yeah, just save them until the end and stick your hand up and we will answer the questions at the end. And yeah, thanks a lot. So hand over to you.
All right. Okay. Well, thank you, Michael, and thanks to Caitlin for organising this. Yeah, so the talk today is a summary of some recent papers from our research using cave speleothems from southwest WA. So I just wanted to say that it's actually really nice to have the opportunity to be sharing this work with a West Australia audience, even if it's remotely from Sydney. And as Michael was just saying, I will be over in WA next week. There's some dates here on the slide. So if there's work presented here that's of interest to you, just send me an email if you're interested in catching up. Okay, so the talk today is actually divided into two parts. So part one, what the speleothem record reveals about current and past rainfall recharge in southwest WA. This is a summary of three recent papers. Primarily this one here that's under review at the moment. That's led by former ANSTO postdoc Stacey Priestley, who's pictured over here. And that work is supported by two other recently published papers. So this one here on the karst hydrology of the southwest caves, and the other on rainfall water isotopes that was led by ANSTO colleague Alan Griffiths. And somebody needs to, turn their mic off. Thanks. Part two of the talk is the paleo-fire record in southwest WA speleothems, and that's based on a paper also published this year, this paper here, that was led by ANSTO postdoc Lisa McDonough. The paleo-fire project is currently funded under an ARC discovery project that's co-led with Andy Baker from UNSW, who's pictured down here in the middle. And we now have another postdoc, Dr. Misha Campbell, who some of you should recognise because she is a former student of your school at UWA. So I'll just also acknowledge that there are numerous other co-authors listed here that have contributed to this work as well. And a special thanks to the West Australia Parks and Wildlife Service, to their staff and their volunteers, because it's the park staff that have really helped us maintain monitoring of these caves over the long term. So their involvement has been absolutely essential for collecting drip water for us, which we then measure the water isotopes and the chemistry, for collecting rainfall, which we're measuring the water isotopes on, and assisting us with data loggers. So we have lots and lots of all these little boxes, which are acoustic drip loggers laid out in the cave, so measuring the recharge through to the cave. And we have weather stations in the cave measuring the microclimate and soil moisture. The monitoring started with 2 caves initially. So one at Yanchep National Park, which is about 50 kilometres to the north of Perth, and this other one at Golgotha Cave down in the Borenup Forest, which is shown on the map here. The monitoring at Yanchep ceased after a few years when it became too dry, but the monitoring at Golgotha Cave has continued to present, and we have now more than 15 years worth of continuous monitoring data for that site. So it's become one of the world's longest and most intensively monitored caves, and it's produced something like 12 papers in total. So it's really been the willingness and generosity of the park staff to assist us with this that has kept it going and created such a rich data set. I was just going to say also that I won't be going into the detail of all the monitoring data here, but just to say that the work that I'm presenting today is underpinned by these monitoring studies, so including the understanding of the proxies, the hydrology, and now developing the fire proxy records from the speleothems. Okay, so just some brief background here, because I think I am probably speaking to quite a broad audience here. So speleothems or cave stalagmites, so it's the ones that are growing from the floor up to the ceiling that are fed by the drip water that we're looking at here. They are well established as archives for terrestrial climate proxy records. The oxygen isotopes are the most commonly used proxy that we measure in the speleothems, and that's because it can be directly related to the oxygen isotope ratio in the rainfall, which becomes the drip water and then is incorporated into the calcite. We can also measure things like trace elements in the speleothems, and that can be related to hydroclimate, aerosol flux, and the weathering of bedrock, soil, and biomass cycling. And we date the speleothems using uranium-thorium dating, and we can also count annual layering in the speleothem. Now, this is something that works particularly well in the southwest WA. We're sort of blessed with the majority of the speleothems that we look at have this annual layering structure, and that's a real bonus for getting very precise chronologies. So sometimes we can physically see the annual layering, but if not, we take our samples to our synchrotron down in Melbourne, where we map the elemental concentrations. So you're looking now at a map of strontium concentrations that's been measured on the X-ray fluorescence beamline. And this seasonal change in the strontium concentrations is because of the very strong seasonality of the climate that you have in southwest WA. So that's hugely beneficial for being able to see these layers and then develop these precise chronologies for the speleothems. And of course, you've got the dune limestone running around the coastline here. So southwest WA is actually one of the most ideal places for doing speleothem research. Okay, so I'll just get into some of the results and the papers for the first part of the talk. So this is about what the speleothem record has revealed about the current and past rainfall recharge for the region. Okay, so in the course of this work, we developed 8 modern speleothem records. So these are speleothem records that have spanned like a large portion of or some part of the 20th century. And we're looking at oxygen isotope records here. So because they're modern speleothems, we can directly compare them with the instrumental record. So one of these records was from north of Perth in the Yanchep area, and the other 7 are from the Cape region. So initially, we're just interested in how well, if you put 8 speleothem records together, how well do they reproduce, and if they all respond to the drying of the region that's occurred since around 1970. So on the figure here, these solid lines are the speleothem records, and the dashed lines are measurements of drip water oxygen isotopes from 4 of the sites where we had commenced collecting the water directly after 4 of those speleothems were removed. Now, what is really most striking here is that there is a common rise, or what we're calling the uptick, in the oxygen isotopes that began after around 1980 that has really accelerated since the 1990s. So very clearly there is a response to recent climate change in this area. Now, because we're interested in how the proxies behave, we really want to nail down, what's driving this uptick. So we can compare it then with the instrumental data. So on the top panel here, this red curve is now that combined speleothem and drip water record as a composite. So we've just taken the average and the standard deviation through those records, and it very clearly highlights that uptick in the 018 data. In the middle here, we have mean annual rainfall calculated using the Bureau's high quality stations from the region. So the blue is averaged over the entire southwest WA region, and the pink is where we've recalculated it just from the stations that are along the coastline to demonstrate that the two decreases in rainfall, so the first one around 1970 and the second one in the late 1990s, that did impact the coastal strip where the caves are located as well. In the bottom here, we have the rainfall oxygen isotopes, so both measured and modelled values. So the pink data are our measurements from near Golgotha Cave, and the green are measurements from the long-term GNIP, or Global Networks of Isotopes in Precipitation site in Perth. The yellow and the orange are calculated data for the last 120 years, and they come from the paper on the rainfall isotopes, so this paper here. So this paper is actually a deep dive into the rainfall isotopes for this region and all the factors that influence that isotopic signal. But basically, one of the key results is that there was a very clear inverse relationship between the rainfall oxygen isotope value and daily rainfall. So we applied this relationship to the daily rainfall time series from those high quality stations from the Bureau, and that's how we get the yellow and the orange time series. So this allows us to quantify what was the associated change in the isotopes at the time of these two rainfall decreases. So it turns out to be really very small, so only a few tenths of a per mil, but we compare this to the speleothem record, and this is at least 1 per mil, closer to 1.5 per mil change. So it's like at least 10 times greater is the isotopic response in the speleothem versus the change in the rainfall. So that means we can rule out that it's that the speleothem oxygen isotopes are a straightforward recording of changes in the rainfall oxygen isotopes, which means that there's something else involved here. So in order to understand that, I have to go just a little bit into the karst hydrology for this region, and that's where this other recent paper comes into this, in case you're interested in the hydrology side of this stuff. So basically, by monitoring these caves, we identified that the drip waters are fed by two main flow types. So there is diffuse flow through that trickles down through the matrix and all the little voids. And then we get flow that becomes focused along the fractures after large recharge events. Now, by measuring the drip water isotopes, we determined that these two flow end members actually differ by almost 1 per mil. And that's what you're seeing in these distributions here. So in the green are the diffuse flow drips, and you can see that they are close to the mean annual rainfall value. And this sort of makes sense that this process would be integrating most of the rainfall events, whereas the focus flow drips are almost a per mil lower, which implies that there's some sort of recharge bias going on. Now that makes sense, as our monitoring shows that the focus flow along these fractures is only activated after these larger recharge events, and we know that it's these large rainfall events that tend to have the lower isotopic values. Okay, so how does all of this flow hydrology help us understand what's driving the uptick? So we interpret that this uptick in the speleothem record is the result of a reduction in focus flow events reaching the cave system. So ultimately what that means, if you've got a reduction in the focus flow, that you're seeing a drift in the isotopic value of the drips towards that diffuse flow M member. Now, we observe from our monitoring as well that the focus flow requires the soils to be saturated to really initiate that downwards movement of water along fractures. So we were interested in looking then at soil moisture and how that has changed over the same time period. So we looked at the Bureau's water balance model and extracted those data, and then calculated the number of days per year that the soils are saturated. So that's this lower panel down here. So prior to the first rainfall decrease, like average across all of the sites, on average there was about, the soils were saturated for about 90 days per year. After that first rainfall decrease, this drops to 74 days per year, and then after the second rainfall decrease, that drops to 36. So this is the largest reduction here associated with the second rainfall decrease. That's an almost 60% drop from that initial value. And that is what coincides with the timing of where you really get that acceleration of the uptick. So yeah, we interpret that the uptick in the speleothem is a result of reduced focus flow, and that is driven by a reduction in the number of days that the soils, or associated with a reduction in the number of days that the soil is saturated. So I just want to go a bit big picture here and comment on whether this study of modern speleothems has any relevance to understanding recharge to groundwater for southwest WA. Because the cave systems, which on this schematic are sitting out here of the whole aquifer systems for southwest WA, these are effectively natural windows within this surface to groundwater recharge pathway. So they're a space where you can literally crawl into the Veda zone and directly measure recharge without it being complicated by extraction. We know that focus flow is an important mechanism for recharging the groundwater, and I'm talking about volumetrically there, but we can think about this isotopically as well. So here's the distributions of these drip waters again in the green and the blue, and overlain in the red curve the distribution calculated for all the Holocene samples of groundwater for the southern Perth Basin. And that confirms that isotopically they're very similar to that focused flow, and supports that the focus flow is representative of recharge to groundwater. So if that's the case, and our modern speleothem record is telling us that, that uptick is telling us that there's been a reduction in focus flow, this implies a much more significant finding that rainfall recharge to groundwater may no longer be reliably occurring at the same rates as it was in the past. So we can actually look a bit further back in time, because one of the speleothem records that were published recently goes back 800 years of continuous growth. So now, having understood that the speleothem record is capturing this process of rainfall recharge to groundwater, we can examine this paleo record for evidence of previous upticks. So the solid line here is the speleothem record, and then I've just added on in the dashed line here. That's the drip water from that specific site that we continued to collect after we removed that speleothem. On the right here is those drip water distributions just rotated now so we can directly compare the values. And I've converted the water onto the calcite scale. So the scale here is directly comparable to the scale on the speleothem. So what we can see is that for much of the last 800 years, these values are all low and in the range of the focus flow. And it's not until this recent uptick that we see the shift towards these higher values. This supports that the current reduction in the focus flow is unprecedented for the last 800 years, which in turn implies that the current rainfall recharge to groundwater is at an unprecedentedly low rate for the last 800 years. So I've also shown down here, it's the Antarctic-based record for Southwest WA variability. So this is a record that's been around for quite some time. It was derived from the Lord Dome ice layer thickness using a statistical relationship with Southwest WA rainfall records. And I just really wanted just to show that even though these two reconstructions represent very different hydroclimate processes, that they're both consistent in showing that this recent shift in the hydroclimate for this region is unprecedented for the last 800 years. And I think good to have more long reconstructions directly from the Southwest WA region to verify that. So just a summary then of this first part of the talk about rainfall recharge and speleothems. So the uptick in the speleothem oxygen isotopes is not primarily due to a shift in the rainfall O18, but reflects a reduction in focus flow reaching the caves. This is actually, it is validation that, you know, you can use Southwest WA O18 records as a hydroclimate proxy, but the karst flow paths are amplifying the isotopic response to climate. The fact that we see no similar magnitude upticks in that longer 800-year speleothem record implies that the current rainfall recharge to groundwater is lower than it has been during the last 800 years. So second part now, so can we use speleothems as paleo-fire records? So just revisiting this introductory slide on speleothems. So I mentioned that we can measure the trace metals in the speleothems and that they can be derived from vegetation. So what happens then if a fire comes along and burns a large portion of that vegetation? That might then release metals that are sequestered in the biomass. So we know that the ash does impact soil leachate because there's been, you know, studies where they measure the chemistry of runoff after fires. So it therefore seems to make sense that it could also impact the drip water chemistry. And if that's the case, you know, can we exploit this and start using this to reconstruct paleo-fire records? So how did we even get here to be looking at fires? This is, from my point of view, something that didn't actually start out to be intentional research. It was more of a serendipitous sort of thing where wildfires actually burnt over the two monitored caves in WA. And around the same time over here in New South Wales, Parks and Wildlife wanted to know if they could conduct hazard reduction burns over the caves without any adverse impacts to the cave environment. This led to a previous project, which was a linkage project with them. And it allowed us to conduct the groundwork. And it was actually also the opportunity to conduct controlled experiments where we could actually set up the monitoring in different cave settings and then deliberately light fires to measure the response in the drip water. These are the papers from that earlier fire project, which was focused on the drip water. And this figure here is Misha's compiled it into a figure to just to get a really nice summary of the proxy response from all these 5 studies. So they're ordered by cave depth and fire intensity. So this study by Bjarne et al. Represented at the top here was from the shallowest cave and had the hottest wildfire impacted. And where there's a coloured bar there, that is indicating that there was a response in the proxies that we were measuring. So either a decrease or an increase, or if it's a white box, then no change. So it's quite clear to see that the biggest response, or the response across that affected more proxies, occurred in the shallowest cave that we were monitoring. This isn't unsurprising, particularly as the signal from fire is more likely to be buffered and attenuated by stored water in the deeper cave systems, which is probably why we didn't see it when we had a controlled fire over this much deeper cave system. So this one is only a couple of meters thick of rock over the cave, whereas in this study here, this is at least 30 meters of rock and therefore flow paths before you reach the drip point. So basically, this earlier study established that we can detect a fire signal in the drip water in shallow caves. So if you want to do paleo-fire records from speleothems, you go to shallow caves. This discovery project then is actually about demonstrating whether we can reconstruct the fire signal in the speleothems themselves. So Southwest WA, again, we've come back here because it is the ideal test site for this, because there are shallow caves, particularly up in the Yanchep area, and we know the fire history for them, and also because of that very clear, beautiful annual layering means that we can precisely date the fire events, which is really important for the calibration work. So in the remaining time then, I'm just going to talk about the results from our recent paper, which is it's this paper up here, and it's a 270-year record of fire and climate from the Yanchep region. So that chronology was developed again by counting these annual layers. And what you're looking at here on the left-hand side, this is a thin section of that calcite speleothem sample. And those brown layers, that beautiful brown clear layering that you're seeing, is actually where there's been a seasonal flush of organic matter that is trapped in the speleothem. You can see that beautiful annual layering in these elemental maps that were generated at the synchrotron. You can see that very clearly there as well. So that chronology is based on counting these layers. So there was something that stood out to us even when we were at the synchrotron acquiring these data and just looking at these maps coming out, and that was this very, very bright band affecting some of the elements here that occurred in around 1897. So the bright yellow in the phosphorus there, that concentration is more than 6 times higher than anywhere else, and of typical concentrations that you'd expect for phosphorus in the speleothem. The other thing that was very suspicious is that if you look at the elemental maps here, you can sort of see that the little crystals that form the fabric have become quite distorted after this event. And we know from our other monitoring that, you could have this leaching and flush of metals from the ash. And this distortion of the little crystals is actually consistent with poisoning of the little crystal growth sites. So that supports that, that we did get this flush of metals come through that we're seeing in that bright band, and then it also was enough to cause a distortion of that of the crystals. So there's quite a bit of evidence there that we knew straight away that we're looking at something very suspiciously that looks like a fire in the speleothem, and probably quite a significant fire as well. So what this is a time series, the time series of all the proxies that were measured. And I won't labour on any of this, but just to show you for people that might be interested of all the things that we did measure. So is that you, Caitlin, or somebody else's mic?
It's somebody else. I'll mute them. Everyone on listening in, please mute your mic if it's not muted. Sorry, continue.
Cheers. Thank you. No worries. So yeah, the top is so that the growth rate that we can calculate from the width of those annual layers. These are the carbon and oxygen isotopes. And the other metals, we're able to expand the suite of metals that we can measure by using laser ablation, ICP-MS. Yeah, and so that's just them in time series, and we've got the organic matter as well that we just measured as grayscale from that thin section image. So it's much easier to try to understand all of that information if we look at a principal components analysis. So on the left-hand side here, you're looking at a time series of the three leading principal components, and on the right-hand side here, you're looking at a loadings biplot. Now, the proxies that load most strongly on PC1 are the hydroclimate sensitive proxies, as we know that from all the monitoring. The ones that are loading most strongly on PC2 are the ones that are weathered from the bedrock, which isn't important for this talk. And then we also had this cluster that load on the third principal component, which are phosphorus, and then these are an aluminium and some of these transition metals, and the organic matter as well. So this is the time series of that third principal components, and these are the proxies that we know are indicative of fire. So we're just going to focus on this time series on this next slide, and that is now the pink, sorry, it's changed from green to pink between these two slides. But we're now looking at the time series of that PC3, which we're interpreting as the fire proxy. And this is just the time series of all those metals that are loading on PC3. So the peaks in these metals are making up the peaks in the PC3. So in terms of methodology, what we did here is we ran an outlier test through there. So that's just a moving window. And if a peak exceeded 2 times the standard deviation in that rolling window, we put down the blue bar. Okay. So the obvious question here is, does the reconstructive fire record, so where we have these blue bars, does it match the known fire events that impacted Yanchep? So the known fire events are listed up here. So that's 2001, 1996, 83, 66, and 77. And you can see that there is a blue bar that for 4 out of the 5 known recent fires. So that was actually a really good result to be able to get such a good match with the fire record. There was an exception, which was 1983, but in this case, we knew, so for each of these fires, we've looked at the satellite imagery, so pre and post fire, and then we've processed that. And we can tell that the fire scar on the satellite imagery indicates that the fire didn't directly impact the cave and that the winds were actually blowing away from the cave during that event. Yeah, so I think this lining up supports that the peaks in PC3 are fire events. And yeah, there's also this 1897 event too that has a nice peak there, and that also supports too that really unusual event that we saw when we were even in the early days sitting there at the synchrotron, that was most likely a paleo-fire event. So just going back then to the PCA on all of the proxies now, because there is climate information. So in PC1, which is our hydroclimate proxy. So we'll bring that back in because it is useful to look at the fire events in the context of the climate proxies. So our PC1 indicates that there were 2 dry periods in the mid and the end of the 19th century. This second dry period coincides, this is the most pronounced one, and it coincides with a drought that was recorded in the Lake Deborah tree ring record that was published recently. Lake Deborah is about 370 kilometres sort of to the east, a little bit north as well of Yanchep. So we think that's interesting, and what's good that 2 records agree, and it also suggests that that major drought period would have extended through to the coast as well. Now, interestingly, the 1897 event is at the end of this drought period. And it's also interesting that it has occurred several decades after what would have been the suppression of Indigenous land management, which would have started happening in around here. So what we're wondering is, so the speleothem paleo record is suggesting that there was quite a significant fire here in 1897. So we're wondering whether it's a combination of suppression of Indigenous land management, permitting a build-up of fuel, and then you've had, you know, a big drought event. I guess not surprising to imagine why that might have led to quite a large fire. So I am almost finished, but I'll just spend just a couple of minutes just updating you on where the fire project is going next. So this is work that largely that Misha Campbell is leading in her postdoc, and it's all focused on the calibration of using ash and modern speleothems to try to calibrate the fire signal in the speleothems. So on the left-hand side here, we're looking at leachates from ash. So park staff were very helpful in collecting ash from Yanchep after that 2019 fire that really impacted that site. And we were also able to get some ash too from the recent fires that affected Burrup. But these data here are just some preliminary results that we're showing you where we've leached the Yanchep ashes. So this figure supports what we've seen in the drip water and the speleothem record, in that we can readily leach phosphorus and some of these other metals from the ash. Now, what we did in the figure here is we separated the black versus the white ash, with white ash indicating that there was more complete combustion of the material. And it appears to be a distinction in the concentrations of the leachates between the black and the white for some of these metals. They say you can quite clearly see it here in the phosphorus. Now, this drop in the concentration from the phosphorus between black and white, incidentally, is consistent with the volatilization temperature for phosphorus. So phosphorus has a relatively low volatilization temperature. So the more you combust that ash, the more phosphorus is going to be volatilized and exported out of the ash, which explains why there'd be lower concentrations of phosphorus in the white ash. So because we're able to, with our techniques, measure a whole bunch of metals, there's actually a range of volatilization temperatures with the suite of metals that we're looking at. And what we're interested now is, could we get to a point where we actually look at the pattern of metals that form those peaks in the speleothem time series, and could that actually tell us about fire intensity, so fire temperature, basically? Yeah, so we'll keep going with that ash data set and expand it with the samples from the Borenup fire as well. And then I'll just tell you about this other calibration work that Michelle is working on here. This is a spatial analysis of little modern speleothems for Yanchep. So, well, during lockdown, it was actually the staff of Yanchep and some volunteers went and collected some little core tops from some active stalagmites in the park, and we were specifically looking at caves with that were impacted by varying fire intensity during that 2019 fire. There was also quite a significant fire that impacted the park in 2005. So we came up with a list of caves that were more or less intensely affected by the fires, and those were the caves that we targeted to try to get a little core top sample that would incorporate that recent growth that would have the 2019 and 2005 fires in them. So the idea now is map those elemental concentrations of these little cubes and see if again that pattern of metals that we see in those peaks, whether we can relate that back to fire intensity. And sorry, I should have just explained what you're looking at here in this map here. So this is where we've taken the satellite images before and after the fire, and they've been processed to, it's called the differential normalized burn index. So it's a map of fire intensity, how that impacted the site. Yeah, so basically a lot more, we're really just trying to nail down how these proxies work, and if we can actually get to a point where we can say something about the intensities of the fires as well. So more work to come. Okay, so this is just a summary of the second half of the talk then on the fire record. So this 270-year record for Yanchep is actually the first time a speleothem record of showing individual or reconstructing individual fire events from inorganic proxies has been shown to be possible. So we've shown that you can construct both fire and climate information from the speleothems. So we think that this could be important for understanding fire and climate relationships on various timescales. So, for Southwest WA, what's the context of these recent fires compared with fires that we can detect in the paleo record? And I think there's a whole lot of other interesting research questions, and it's, you could apply these techniques outside of Southwest WA. Speleothem records go back deep in time, or deep into the Pleistocene, so tens to hundreds of thousands of year long records. So, you know, humans and their relationship with fire, maybe we can use this sort of technique to start tracking human migration in the past. So I think all sorts of interesting research questions that maybe can be sprung out of, you know, now going into reconstructing fire out of speleothems. And just to say, you know, our current focus is on this calibration work that I've shown you. So can we also use the trace metals to reconstruct fire intensity? And our ultimate goal, at least with this discovery project, is to construct a last millennium record, so the last 1,000 years of a combined fire and climate record for Southwest WA. So maybe you'll see that in a while at the end of the project. Anyway, that's the end of the talk. Again, there's just my email address there if you'd like to drop me a line if you are interested in meeting up while I'm over there. And thanks very much for listening.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Pauline. That was an excellent, excellent talk. I've learned so much more about speleothems and their application in looking at rainfall records as well as fire. It was just a really fascinating talk, and I'm sure folks listening online will wholeheartedly agree with me there. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to pop them in the chat for Pauline, or unmute yourself now that Pauline's finished her talk and ask your question in person. You're more than welcome to do that. I believe we did have one in the chat from Nancy Boland. So would you like me to read it out, or are you happy to read it and answer? What would you prefer, Pauline?
I am just quickly trying to read it. So it's about speciation of metals. Yep, fires changes the speciation of chromium. Yeah, yes. Yeah, so thinking along all of those lines, I'm talking to some of the synchrotron people to see if we can use their hexanes techniques, which so you will go into one of those maps and actually try to figure out the speciation, the oxidation state, and the coordination of some of these metals, just to try to get a bit more of an understanding of, you know, what were they, why are they even there? What were they attached to when they were, you know, moving down the flow path? Yeah, just to really get at those processes. And yeah, that's a great question.
Thank you. I was also really fascinated listening to your talk and wondering about the application of using speleothems to track changes in temperature, because you showed a really nice pattern with rainfall. And has there been much work, I guess, in the rising temperature space at all?
So do you mean for Southwest WA or?
I mean, maybe, yes. Specifically, yes, but just in general, having not really come from a background of knowing much about proxy records. I mean, there are some, I guess, that, you know, with tree rings and stuff, you can kind of track drought periods, and you'd assume that drought periods tend to reflect rainfall, but also air temperature. And so whether or not that's something that we can be using these records to track.
Yeah, so you actually have to start using some different sorts of proxies, which I haven't been involved in. And it's a little bit, it's a bit of a holy grail too, is getting temperature out of speleothems, and it's a little bit more complicated, I think, than, yeah, it's not easy. It's analytically quite challenging. So there's a few techniques you can basically, because, you know, there is a fractionation between the fluid and the calcite that's temperature dependent. But because your source fluid, your drip water, the isotopes are changing from that rainfall, and all the fracture flow paths are changing that drip water, you can't actually constrain what that was in the past in order to apply that fractionation to reconstruct temperature. So I say that, but you can, if you could extract the fluid out of the fluid inclusions and then calculate that. And I told a lie, because I am actually working, I just remembered, with one of my former postdocs in Germany, has been doing a bit of that work. So maybe we will get to temperature. It's still quite tricky. There are some organic biomarkers that you can try and use to reconstruct temperature, but yeah, analytically challenging trying to get. There's also noble gases too, people trying that space. The error bars on all of those techniques for the temperature tend to be quite large, unfortunately.
So work in progress, cool. And I guess following on from that, I'll direct you to Caroline Mather's question, because she's asked, is it possible to use clumped isotopes to determine temperature?
Yeah, that's the other one that I actually, sorry, just forgot about. But I haven't had a lot of experience with that. So, you know, I'd be open to anybody who does have one of those labs that wants some speleothems too, that are well constrained, that anyone wanted to work on that stuff.
Cool, thank you. And Gavin McGrath has also asked a question in the chat. I'll read it out just in case that the chat's not actually captured on the recording. But Gavin has asked whether we could better discriminate the relative contributions in the effects that are contributing to the enrichment of oxygen-18, such as distinguishing evaporative enrichment, changes to the rainfall amount effects, and then the preferential recharge effects, which you showed today.
Okay, all right. So that's a big question. So can we discriminate the relative contributions? So teasing them all out, then, I guess, is what he's saying. So in theory, yes. So the paper that I showed, that I said was all about the karst hydrology and the flow paths, that was published in March. It starts with a title like Ubiquitous Flow Path Control in a Global Study. There's actually 4 speleothem records in that all grew over the last millennium, and each of them has a different flow path type. So we have one that's a diffuse flow M member, and then we have one that's fracture flow, and then one's in between. So I think in theory, if you had a really good karst hydrology model of this, you could actually use that model and invert the information that is in those records to try to back out basically how the distributions, at least, of rainfall have changed. So we see things like where the gap between or the mean value of the isotopes between the diffuse flow speleothems and the fracture flow ones is widening, and that suggests that there's been a lot more recharge along the fractures. So I think that sort of information you could pull out. You would need a model to do anything quantitative about it, which we don't quite have yet. We're still working on.
Great, thank you. So watch this space.
Yeah.
Any other questions at all for Pauline? Don't be shy. If not, then on behalf of everyone listening, I'd like to thank you again, Pauline, for a really wonderful talk. It was fascinating to see some of the work that you've been doing with speleothems and linking them to rainfall and fire patterns in southwest WA. And so, yeah, with that, thanks everyone for tuning in, and yeah, enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks again, Pauline.
Okay, no problem. And thanks very much for the opportunity. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.